Okay, so I think we are good now to start. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here in another session of JSET. We are really glad to see so many people here online and here with us. We are really excited with our guests today that we're going to approach topics regarding transdisciplinary and feminist approaches. So I'm not going to spend so many times introducing you because I think that is much more interesting to having you talking. So we can start. I don't know if Juliana or Doreen or Jen want to start? Or Juliana?
I was joking with some other people that they always do like rock, paper, scissors, but I don't know if I win or not. Like, I don't know why so many people know that thing. But
I do. I could help you figure it out.
okay. But I need to know beforehand because I want to win. But okay, I can go. Let's just get this rolling because I know we have a short amount of time. You want me to go?
Yeah.
I'll share screen.
Yeah, sure.
Try to do this.
Is the camera on here? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's the thing that we are not, yeah. There we go.
So I have presenter view, but it's looking like. Doesn't really matter. We gotta go. This looks fine. We can go.
Yeah.
Because usually it just does the full screen, but for some reason you're also getting that little thumbnail things on the side, but you just get a sense of what's coming up next. So again, the title, seriously, there you go. Indigenous ecologies and genealogies of within gender tradition. So there's just a slight modification in the title. So I think when I gave it to y'all, I did of. And then as I was working on it, I'm like, is it of or is it within? And then I literally couldn't say if it is either or. I feel like it's and both. And I do think that that's significant in the overall framing of what I'm trying to give you all today, within like 10 minutes. So this is, I have a propensity to always have way too much stuff. So I've been trying really hard to kind of hone down. So hopefully it's enough, but not too much. Okay, so I've been in this space, working in this space for like over a couple decades now, and I don't want to count them anymore. And part of why I'm saying that is it drives this title because I feel like early on in work, particularly around Indigenous understandings, people have oversimplified so much within Indigenous spaces. And really pushing that this isn't just an indigenous gender conversation, that if truly you want to understand Indigenous ways, and the ways in which gender is of and within, we have to see them in ecologies and genealogies. So that's the push here. And again, after quite a few decades of work in this space where I've seen for a variety of reasons and oversimplification, and I'm even going to touch a little bit on when and how you're going to see Indigenous feminisms, because I think all of a sudden, everything that has to do with, particularly with Indigenous women, is now said Indigenous feminism, and putting a direct line in there, which we need to disrupt in some spaces, and we'll see why. So again, just highlighting that title. So I am Dr. Doreen Martinez. I'm in the Department of Race, Gender, and Ethnic Studies right here at CSU. But I want to start. So the first thing I wanted to start with is this understanding of gendered rivers. And I am intentionally starting here as a way to do some of what I've actually just even kind of framed and set up, is disrupting this conversation around gender, which also tends to just be located on bodies. And how that has been kind of a failing of sorts, or at least again, a minuscule way of understanding gender traditions within Indigenous spaces. And as you'll see here, just even in this quote, which actually comes from the book on gender and rock art, and certainly at minimum, we're going to understand rock art having an Indigenous location, not only, but certainly heavily. But in this book, Gender and Rock Art, we can understand that not only can an image be gendered, so what you would see in the rock art, but so can the places. So the aspects of physical locations that people who make rock art, i.e. heavily Indigenous, right, apparently are valued in these specific place settings that are gendered, okay? So a gendered river is one, but you also have like geomorphological attributes. Anybody guess at that one? Literally, the picture helps a little bit. Like, what is the geology there? And understanding, though, that people will read that geology with certain attributes and characteristics, which they see as gendered, which is why you will have some rivers. And this is heavily Navajo Nation, so you can also just look here locally, has gendered rivers they actually recognize. And even if you think of a view set, so you're going to think about characteristics of gender that are also understood as characteristics of place, not just body, right? And we'll get to some specifics. I'll give you some in terms of how you outline that, but I thought it was really striking that even in the rock art, so what they're saying is that you're going to put particular rock art, not just because it's a smooth location, but because the characteristics of that location and how we see that location. So, and you'll see this in terms of some philosophies of the Navajo, where like if the river might be actually a space where there's just a lushness or like a lot of birth, they might look at that as a feminine attribute. But even passages of light and how the light comes through there, the acoustic properties. And I was very fortunate last year to go down the Grand Canyon with the Navajo Nation, and just it's striking when you see the different light, you see the different acoustic properties, and there was a space where you really felt like a heartbeat happening acoustically, right? So then plants that grow there, all of these. But I'm starting here because I think that that's one of the most significant things, is you have to see gender traditions of and within these larger ecologies and ways of understanding. So I'm going to, again, just really quickly, again, because of time, shit, I'm already at 5 minutes. Excuse my language, that this is tied to community. Again, this nature of the beast, learn, make it up as you go, this way of understanding community. I want to get to these very specifically in terms of Dene masculinities, which this chapter is in here by Lloyd Lee, but also Banjay Nez talks about this. And I want to do this real specifically because of the gendered understanding that she gives you. And that the Dene epistemologically have a complex system of knowledge that encompasses two paradigms. The beauty way, which is often defined as the director and cause of all good and is seen as feminine, and the protection way, which is defined as indestructible, and an eternal being, which is defined as masculine. That these are fundamental cosmological ways of understanding Dene masculinities, gender, i.e., key to this is that the two do not operate alone and apart, but are complements to halves of each other. Okay. And again, there's very specific language here that in those two ways, the beauty way and the protection way, this means to live in Hojo, which is core to the philosophy of walk in beauty, in peace, balance, beauty, and harmony. You'll often hear the phrase walking in beauty. And then if you think about this in connection to community, then you'll see why there's principles of community about peace, balance, and beauty that also mirror onto the philosophies of Dene masculinities. And again, gender, because it's this SNBH formula, which is about planning, learning, thinking, living, reflecting. But look that it also includes the 4 sacred mountains, the 4 sacred minerals, the 4 parts of the day, the 4 seasons of the year, and the lifespan of the human being. So you see much more of an interrelatedness in terms of gender that's happening within these epistemological cosmology understandings, implicitly a connection to our spaces as part of understanding our methods and how we actually function. And again, because of time, I'm going to jump, told you I had too much. To literally this piece, which is We Are Dancing for You, and particularly because I want to highlight then from the work that Lloyd Lee gave and Banjay Nez around the SNBH process, is We Are Dancing for You, which is Kucha Rising Baldy, and her work is Native feminism and the revitalization of women of coming of age ceremonies. So quickly though, please note, like these are 2 of many other pieces out in Indigenous spaces where this work is being pursued. Very much a gendered understanding of masculinity, very much a gendered understanding in terms of ceremony, significantly in terms of We Are Dancing for You. So you will see that one quote that I pulled from We Are Dancing for You is that there's an embodied and physical enactment of a decolonization that happens in ceremony. And as Lisa Hall argues, it is intellectual, political, artistic, and spiritual as a reclamation of the colonized body, and it's the center of that work. So you see ceremony, here's the one place in which you can go to feminism because of the work that we're understanding, that it's a decolonizing process of ceremony. So there's some way in which if you want to talk about feminism, you have to look at the role of colonization. But if you're just talking about gender, don't always throw feminism on there. Don't always throw feminism if it's Indigenous women, because then you actually are westernizing it. And there's an article out that literally says, there's no word for feminism in my language. That actually is from an Indigenous scholar. So you want to place that accordingly. But in We Are Dancing for You, again, going further with the role of ceremony, specifically that ceremony, you are looking at reconstructing tradition and ceremony because those were disrupted by colonization. So that's where she's going to feminization, feminism. But she says that, remember, that these are clear demonstrations of gendered and sexuality possibilities that are challenging the very fabric of settler colonial culture and society. Some of that challenge literally is that there is place and value of the masculine and the feminine. And we're not looking at erasing, and in some part you get this kind of hyper mythology. It's like, oh, but they had 5 genders, and it's like, slow down, people, and like look at what's actually there. In this process with ceremony, there's still time to make our own laws and recognize, this is not that, I actually would jump too far. Shoot, yeah, I did. So this is the other one I just want to mention, and I'm just looking at my clock and y'all got to help me here. So in this process of literally women coming of age ceremonies articulate community-based methodologies. And I think this is what's really striking about how they're naming this. There is a reclaiming, and look, they're always putting the re in brackets. There is a rewriting. There's a rewriting R-I-G-H-T, but then there's a rewriting R-I-T-E-I-N-G as part of very ancient knowledges developed by Indigenous peoples. So they see this process, and again, the brackets there are acknowledging it's happened traditionally and historically, and we're bringing it back in terms of these processes. And it's really significant in this work that Kucha Balding is giving you in terms of how we're understanding Indigenous gender, again, in ecologies and genealogies. Genealogies tracking that history, ecologies actually placing some of this literally in nature. And again, this is just like super, super fast. Like, and I know I just did that. I have stuff on nature here. I want to end with this last image, right? Because I got like 11 minutes on there. It's supposed to be around 10. This last image, I actually picked these 2 pictures specifically in terms of how to wrap this up and asking if there's questions. I don't know if we'll wait till the end in terms of questions. But I also want you all to think about considerations, impacts, and again, some tag there on feminism. But these 2 pictures to me are really striking, and they've actually circulated quite a bit in Indigenous spaces. And I think part of where I want to show you is very contemporary. The picture on the left is actually Hopi children. And again, they're going to school, they have their laptop cases, but there is a significance in terms of attire, dress, what it means to mark yourself. Those are the, but also can be contemporary. Good old pair of shades there going on, right? As they're going. And the image on the other side is literally also an image that's very common, or not common, but has frequent spaces where you see this intergenerational image with a grandmother and a grandchild, but also an umbrella. So I wanted to end there at images in terms of taking some of the things I just spewed really quickly at you and to reinforce it in terms of this is what goes on in Indian country. So that was, sorry, 12 minutes, 11 minutes.
Thank you, William.
Yeah.
I think it's a good idea to leave questions and comments like for the end. So yeah, are you ready?
I can't connect.
I mean,
It's so
it's all
weird.
good.
It doesn't want to allow me in.
Well, with some of your students.
Hopefully it will work. It might be one of those days.
It might be.
Mhm. Yeah.
It happens for sure.
Yeah.
At AAG, I had technical difficulties and the discussant reminded everybody at the end, they're like, we don't have much time for question and answers because of the technical difficulties.
I know. Technical difficulties.
Happens also.
Okay, so I'll try and go as fast as I can. So next slide, please. Yeah, bear with me as I do this. So I'm sharing my work on Native Alaska women in fisheries, and this project inspired me because I did my dissertation on gendered fisheries in Brazil. My mother and my grandmother, my maternal ancestry and paternal were fishers in a very rural place. And I ended up working at NOAA Fisheries Alaska Fisheries Science Center. And the next slide, I learned that almost 40% of the permit holders of salmon set nets were women. And I was like, oh, wow, what's going on? And I really wanted to get engaged. And so just a quick background. In 1973, they implemented a limited entry permit system, so it wasn't open access anymore, which is not great. But they gave permits, set net permits to women, which you fish from the shore, and drift net permits to men, which you fish from a boat, very broadly. Subsistence permits, anyone can subsistence fish in Alaska if you've lived there for 1 year or more. Nowadays, it's hard to find a site.
Thank you to share the screen, because somebody just put in the chat that they can't see it, this slide.
Oh,
Oh
okay.
my God.
And there are 5 species of salmon up in Alaska. They are king, sockeye, coho, pink, and chum. King salmon are the most valuable, and they are becoming more and more rare. Just for background. So yeah, so that's a quick background. And salmon fishing is very rural. If you want to go, okay, so methodology. I wanted to go dive deeper into women's roles and knowledge in fisheries. Part of the inspiration for this was even up in Alaska, when scientists are seeking traditional knowledge or indigenous knowledge, they neglect women. Women are also excluded from policymaking in general from fisheries, as it was in Brazil. And so setting this up, quote from King England, women are knowledgeable agents accepted as experts of their own knowledge. We did oral histories. I'll talk quickly on the next page. And Kovach, who's an Indigenous scholar, quotes stories work as decolonizing action that give voice. So we wanted to hear women's stories. Next slide. And so our methods were qualitative and video ethnography. So we did interviews with women, and all of them we were recorded, except one who didn't want to be video recorded, but there were video recordings. It was a partnership with Bristol Bay Native Association, and we interviewed 23 women. Next slide. And in terms of ethics, the Council of Bristol Bay Native Association needed to approve this project. They were excited about it because they said no one ever wanted to come up and talk like about what women were doing. And so also from these interviews, they are public. All the women own their data. So we gave them copies of everything, the video, the audio, the transcripts. They approved everything. It was cycles over a year of back and forth of reviewing material and that sort of thing. It was also a means to create a partnership with Bristol Bay Native Association. And we also did a quick workshop on these methods because one of the people we worked with, a collaborator, was interested in continuing this with elders in the community. So next slide. And so part of this too is we wanted to produce some visuals for like outreach or just education, and we managed to make a couple of short video skits from all of this. And so this was just our method: codes, themes, storyboarding, and producing products. Next slide, please. And these are the themes that came out. These in the middle are the broad themes: identity and place, women's roles and knowledge, social cohesion related to family. And then they talked about changing environment too. All the color-coded language on the side are actually our codes from the qualitative methods that inform this. Next slide, please. And you can click, sorry. So these are some quotes from them. You can keep click it 2 more times. So they talked about how women mainly set net from the shore because of childcare responsibilities. It was like this in Brazil. Women weren't really going to go out on boats and put their children at risk. So that was a big thing. But also related to this with the fishing, it was very family oriented. Kids learn young, and it was a way to teach values and responsibility to children. The top right is Alana Hurley's making a statement about generations fishing there at this Clark's Point for many, many generations, and them not seeing that change. And then related to identity and place, Leilani Lurs talks about it's my life. If you take this away from us, I mean, that's who we are. If you take it away, we are nothing. But moving forward, I have a quick short video. It's 4 minutes. All right, but before that, so place was really important. Aspects of just your identity and where you are, and as like Doreen mentioned. Next slide. And it's not just place, but it's the deep rooted connection. One of the women we interviewed said that when they, I won't play the audio about when they bring the children to the fish camp to the site when they're young, they have them put dirt in their mouth so that they understand it in the earth understands them and it will continue to provide for them. So identity in place is very deeply rooted. The next slide. And women's knowledge. And so this is key. There's a lot of shared knowledge and space outside, but women are often going to harvest in different areas and they might be aware of surroundings and the changes in the environment that are different. So women's knowledge is very important. Okay, next slide. Trying to get to the video. Okay, can hit play. Can you turn the volume up? Sorry, I'm going really fast too. And I'm sorry, I don't have closed captions in this. I had my computer set up differently, so this will only be sound.
Same age.
I was born into a fishing family on both sides. My grandfather on my mom's side came from Greece and my dad's father came from Norway. Then you also have our native Yupik side. We've been here for thousands of years, living off of our renewable resources that we have here in Bristol Bay. I think that the important thing is the family bond, the bond that you have with being with your family as you're gathering. All of my sisters and I, we usually do fish together, even if it's just for a time, but we all congregate during the summertime and come together, get things ready. And it's something that you look forward to every year. It's something that, you know, fishing comes around and the people that have their subsistence sites on the beach, you pass them on the road through the winter and you wave. But it's those conversations and the summer connections that you have in the summertime along the beach that are really important. You know, how are you doing? How is your winter? How is your family doing? Spent all the summers of my life here in Bristol Bay, harvesting and putting up fish with my grandmother. Everything revolved around fishing. Everything revolved around putting up the fish, checking the net. We'd all pile in the cars and go check the net, bring the fish back, and watch our grandma for years until we started getting into that role to where we would help her. She put up a really good fish product. And I'm just so thankful that she has passed that on to us. My sisters and I, we still call each other up and we're like, how many minutes do we soak the, you know, the flatfish or the strips? So now we're the ones that are carrying that. So we always are reflecting back to the things that our grandma taught us. We pass that on to the next generations of our family. They look up as a teacher, and I need to, that bond that I felt with my grandma as teaching me, I need to be that bond to my family. Having your teacher, whether, you know, it was my grandma teaching me how to do it, but you have that bond, and that bond is something that you hold on to, and that's what I'm gonna pass down to my nieces and nephews, to my children. As I become older, you really value where you are, and to really appreciate where you are and to know where you come from is very important. But what's even more important is that you never forget where you come from. Never forget our grandmas and our grandpas that taught us, because they want us to continue to pass things on.
Like, sorry, I'd rather you all hear them speak than me, so that maybe that seemed a little long for our time. But the importance of that one is the intergenerational knowledge transfer and the deep bonds from grandma to grandchildren. And so women play a major role in passing on this knowledge, fisheries knowledge of the land across generations and maintaining these fisheries permits, even though the permits it is a colonial system. They contribute to family well-being and community well-being. The goal is like women's knowledge should be informing fisheries management. And in fact, both of two of our interviewees, and Gayla, who is our partner collaborator with this, is the Natural Resources Director at Bristol Bay Native Association. And Alana Hurley is the executive of the United Tribes of Bristol Bay. So they are very active in governance and trying to shift policy and that sort of thing. And so they wear multiple hats, and it's very impressive, and it was wonderful to work with them. And even Obama was there in 2015 before I got there, and he was helping Alana Hurley pick fish. Alana Hurley is in the purple on the left. He's the first president to go and talk to people about climate change up there. Next slide. And that's it. Next slide. That's another woman we interviewed. That's a cover of National Geographic from years ago. Sam and his life. We don't have to go through that, but I was just bringing together my work from Brazil and in this, and the similarities in these rural contexts. And that's it. Thank you. Next slide. Yeah. 2 minutes till 12:30.
We are good.
You all get to see this thing. A longer version. Thanks, Jessica.
Thank you. I think it's your turn now.
Juliana, do you want to put the slides up? So this is a joint presentation, because Juliana led this work that we're going to talk about. And so I wanted to invite her to give the talk. So a little bit of history. Juliana was a student in the Conservation Leadership Program here, which we have some students here who are CLTLers, Juliana. And we do projects with organizations and agencies. That's what all students have to do for their capstone project. And so Juliana was collaborating with the Center for Protected Area Management, which is based here at CSU, and it's housed in the Human Dimensions Department, but it really runs as a quasi non-governmental organization. That's how I would frame it. And they do work on capacity sharing. And so they've been very interested in women in protected area management because they do capacity sharing events. They've done those for over 30 years. They're very, very successful. And over the last 20 years, they've seen a lot more women involved in coming to these capacity sharing events. And so some of the work that Juliana's presenting today really reflects on their programs and their projects and their interests, because we are collaborators. I'm Jen Solomon. I'm a professor in HDNR. And Juliana, go ahead, introduce yourself and take it away.
Thank you, Jen. Hi, everyone. My name is Juliana Rodriguez. My pronouns are she, her, ella, and I'm a conservation professional with a strong interest in gender equity and leadership in Latin America. And it was a pleasure doing this study with Jen and Megan and the team at CPAM and knowing all of this women virtually, indirectly. But yeah, I'll get moving. So the area of study is Latin America, which is also known as the treasure house of natural resources. And as many of you probably know, unfortunately, the richness of its vast area and territories has been a constant target of negative human impact on the environment. So with protected areas as one of the major conservation tools used to protect natural resources around the world, well, it is a crucial conservation tool, and Latin America is such a vulnerable region, rich region. So it is critical to look at the role that effective conservation leadership can play in addressing the complex socio-ecological challenges in Latin America. So in Latin America, leadership dynamics are profoundly shaped by two rooted social constructs that is stem from the region's colonial past. So colonization laid the groundwork really for those rigid gender norms and the systemic discrimination that exists. And it resulted from a male-centered social hierarchy that gave rise to two gender ideologies. So the first ideology is machismo, which emphasizes really just exaggerated masculinity, and reinforces male dominance and control and authority across social and political and even economic spheres. But in contrast, we found the other one, which is Marianismo, is not very common to hear this term, but this social construct portrays and really idolizes women as being morally superior, and it embodies them as having always self-sacrifice and humility and basically just unwavering devotion. And so it often really puts women in a position where they don't put themselves first or they make independent choices. Oh, can you guys see the presentation?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So together, these binary and polarized constructs have shaped longstanding gender role expectations, and they have sustained prejudice, specifically and particularly against women. So the legacies of these roles continue to deepen and enlarge that gender gap and limit equitable access to leadership opportunities in which women, men, and non-binary individuals have very different access to resources. So now I'm gonna go through the social ecological context. And so as I was mentioning before, those very heavy enduring impacts of colonization are paired with injustices like illegal extraction of natural resources and violence and systemic corruption. And all of those ones represent the major threats in the system. So these conditions have contributed with something that is being recognized as triple struggle or triple discrimination, which reflects layer oppression that is rooted in gender and ethnicity and social class. And those are all reinforced things that are, it's all reinforced by narratives of cultural superiority. So that interplay of domination, exclusion, and power that is fueled by historical legacies and the different hierarchies, social hierarchies, and the structural inequalities, they cut across like all of the different identities. And so with this complexity, the marginalization of women becomes even more visible and is more revealing of the wide spectrum of gender-related obstacles. So one of these challenges is persistent. It devaluates women professional roles. And so in women leadership positions, they have been affected by the belief that being a leader is traditionally a masculine role and it has a masculine tone, which implies that the women lack the necessary skills for success in leadership. So ultimately, these dynamics have posed significant barriers for women working in conservation leadership. But as all systems, there are always opportunities, and the opportunity here is for socially just and effective conservation. So yeah, with this study, we wanted to respond to two research questions. What were the challenges that women conservation leaders were facing, and what were their supports that were helping them navigate these challenges? So I used the conceptual framework of the challenges and supports model by Jones and Solomon, shown in their research study in 2020 with women conservation leaders in the United States. So we did online, because it was COVID, a structured survey, and that was guided by a very extensive literature review that was done both in English and Spanish. That is the information that fed those concept maps that I just showed. There were 2 inclusion criteria that were taken in consideration to identify the respondents. They all must have participated in one of 3 CPAM courses, and they all must have identified as women at the time that they apply. So the survey reached 201 women. We use Qualtrics, and for data analysis, we use SPSS for descriptive and inferential analysis. And then for the open-ended responses, we systematically coded them and organized them into themes and subthemes and their corresponding descriptions. So we had 100 women respond in the survey, which was 49% completion rate, representing 17 Latin American countries. Most of the women identify as Hispanic or Latina. About of them had completed a master's degree, so that showed that they were highly educated women. The majority of them had a middle to a senior professional level or role, which indicated high leadership positions. And then over half of them had been in the conservation field for over a decade. I'll pass it on to you, Jen.
Okay, I'll briefly go through this because I know we're running short on time. So Megan Jones, who's now at Oregon State, who also was a CLTL student, led the study that was published in 2019. And there were certain themes that were identified as barriers to women's leadership. Motherhood being one, salary inequality was another that came out quite strongly. Women are paid less than male colleagues at the same professional level. Organizations don't strive for salary equality within organizations. So there's gendered salary inequality. There's formal exclusion, so less competent men hold higher leadership positions than women. And informal exclusion, those are the types of things, where do you get invited? Or are you even in the room in those decision-making spaces, right? Or you're talked over at meetings, or men take the ideas of yours as a woman. Assumption of inadequacy, women feel they have to work harder than men. And then harassment, and this includes both verbal and physical sexual harassment, so unwanted behaviors. I'm summing that up quite quickly. Juliana, do you have anything to add? And go forth.
No, I know we're like running short on time, but thank you. So these challenges that now I'm showing were challenges that were specific to the Latin American region. And so when we analyze the open-ended responses, we noticed that the interactions that the women were describing actually reflected patterns of machismo and marianismo. And so within that category, 3 subcategories arise. The first one, assumption of weakness. So women were perceived as being too fragile and emotional to do their job. So it alludes to marianismo. Social exclusion. There were respondents that mentioned situations where they were being disrespected by male community leaders or members, sometimes even women, and facing rejection to be accepted as a leader and a knowledgeable woman, and also workplace exclusion. Then the other 2 challenges that appear, there are not categorized specifically as gender specific issues, but they're still important to highlight. So several respondents identify personal insecurity as a concern. So as you can see on the figure that shows 70% of the countries with the highest rates of murder, environmental, and social leaders in 2019 are actually Latin American countries. And so as you may know, Latin America has endured a long history of violence and corruption. And so this legacy has deeply affected the region's security landscape, which in turn has created significant obstacles for conservation efforts, and they particularly affect women that work in the field. And then the other one was political interference in conservation leadership hiring processes. So in many cases, leadership roles are awarded based on political affiliation or like the connections that they have rather than on qualifications or merits of the candidates. Then to answer the second question, what were the supports? These two supports were also uncovered by Dr. Solomon and Dr. Jones, and they included organizational supports that were characterized by gender equity policies and culture, and supporter relationships, which included from male colleagues, leaders, and some of them even mentioned families that supported and respected the conservation careers. And that was specifically to women that worked in the field. And lastly, one of the supports that emerged that was unique to Latin America was women's social movements. So this was interesting because this was something that we were initially set out to explore. It just came up organically. And it was such a powerful reminder of that conservation is deeply intertwined with cultural dynamics. So across the region, these movements have played a significant role in advancing women's visibility and representation in both professional and decision-making spaces. So a couple of the respondents actually acknowledged that these movements have helped dismantle gender stereotypes and actually draw attention between the intersection that woman oppression that happens to women being oppressed, along with the exploitation of natural resources. So that was quite interesting. And then as a conclusion, I mean, it's just important to remember that we're not all the same, that we're not a homogeneous group. We have different backgrounds, and we as women face different challenges that are based on our different identities, but also our circumstances. And so many of these challenges are just deeply rooted in social and gender structures that show up in the workplace, sometimes in subtle ways. And so moving forward, we just need to pay attention to those social cultural forces that play and interact with all of us and the different type of beings that we are as women. And we cannot assume structural changes that will benefit everybody, because you will be leaving others behind. And that is all. Thank you so much for your time.
And the Center for Protected Area Management has taken the work that was led by Megan Jones and Juliana, and they created a course that was run, and it was provided to women from 55 different nations. They had over 200 women participate, and they were in the midst of creating a course recently for male allies in Brazil, but all funding has been cut for both programs. So that's where we're at. Yeah, tremendous work effort on their part to use the data and work with us on data creation.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for those insightful talks. We can proceed with the session of questions and comments. Also, people in the chat.
Do any of you have questions or comments for each other?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. It was very interesting. And what caught my attention was the Marianism finding. And in one of your slides, you mentioned that Marianism kind of is a way for women to reframe their views. Can you expand maybe a little bit on that and give some examples of how this narrative of Marianism influences women? So.
I couldn't hear very well. I'm sorry.
A little bit closer.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Thank you, Juliana. Yeah, I was wondering if you can explain or expand a little bit more on the Marianism findings and give some examples of how this narrative allowed, or how this come up in the woman examples. You said that helped them or push them to reframe their stories, is what I'm curious.
Yeah. So Marianismo, it really portrays women as having a lot of sense of self-sacrifice. And so when we were analyzing all of the responses, there was a trend of seeing situations really intersecting with the majority of the challenges, like motherhood, is self-sacrifice and is like a lot of devotion where you don't put yourself first. And for that instance, socially, you're taking advantage in a way. I'm not saying we never attempt to say that Marianismo is something that is negative, but it just shouldn't be something that identifies all of the women, right? We're all very different. So it does have very unique characteristics that can be taken as very positively, but that doesn't mean that it characterizes all as women to be morally superior or have self-sacrifice and humility and devotion. So some of the cases, I think the most prevalent areas were really when women were considered as being too fragile to do certain, perform certain activities of the job or responsibilities of the job in the field. And that there were other examples that we couldn't share on our research because they're too specific to the person, and we also have to protect those experiences of the women that trusted us with responses on those interviews. We did have one interview that was actually over the phone because she had a lot to share. But Jen, do you have anything to add?
No, I think
Perhaps a follow-up question,
Yeah, you
like
have
how did you come up with these categories, Marianismo? Because machismo is something like it's very common to hear, right, around machismo, but Marianismo.
did you hear the question, Juliana? Like, how did
Yeah.
you connect to Marianismo?
Yeah, so there was a very extensive literature review that was done both in English and in Spanish. And so the term has actually has been mentioned in the literature. Not to say it needs so much research because there's not much information out there. But when you have a social construct, you always tend to have another one that defies it, to say it that way. And so if machismo exists, then what is the other one that opposes it? And that's what we found on the literature. But there's still so much to uncover. There are huge gaps in the literature related to machismo and Marianismo specifically.
So again, to kind of jump in here though too, because one is if you have a binary social construct, it's always, then you'll find another one. So please don't know this. Everything's a social construct. Everything 2 + 2 is 4 is a social construct. Okay, so because sometimes people don't understand that, right? But so this work to me, what draws my curiosity, even based on my presentation, is how did we understand gender prior to colonization? So this is the result of colonization past, in which I think some of what happens is language, because it's still the same language. So the concepts of Marianismo and machismo existed prior. But in collective societies, they would have had other functions as gender functions. And then because the language continued, although colonization gets woven in here, then that's when these other negative attributes end up happening. So then that even machismo takes on much more of this kind of domineering presence, right? Because it has to meet patriarchy now, right? And then because machismo has to meet patriarchy, then that's when Marianismo now also then has to do the binary relationship between the two. But you have to see these as post-colonization impacts. What would be fascinating is to see what were the gendered expectations. I know in some indigenous societies, yeah, that there is a sense of that motherhood, it's literally a gift. So I might end up like not being the first and focus of it, and somebody might interpret that I'm sacrificing, but that's okay because I see it as a gift, right? So you kind of have to go prior at times to be able to understand how it marks itself now. And definitely, as they showed on that big chart, like the key factor was colonization. And even in this, what would be striking to kind of look at, what was the role of religion? That's always a really big one, particularly in Latin American countries. Capitalism is easily another one, because those would have created these systems even in terms of where the experiences are. But in most Latin American countries, indigenous populations, you had definitely gendered roles and expectations, but it was for egalitarianism and collectivism. And then it was colonization that really pushed it into these spaces.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will just add to that it is important to recognize that this study was done such a large region. So there, I mean, one country could have a number of these studies and uncover many different type of challenges and supports just because the cultural differences are quite large, even within, one small region out of that whole geographic section that we concentrated in studying.
Thank you, guys.
I have a question for Dr. Martinez that relates to what you were just talking about in your presentation. You said something along the lines of how important it is to disrupt the application of feminism to Indigenous epistemologies around gender. And I think in concept, I can grasp what that looks like. And what I'm curious is, can you talk a little bit more about what does it look like in practice?
In practice, it acknowledges these as Indigenous traditions, not Indigenous feminist traditions. Right? And this is part of what happens at times. I actually wanted to get a little bit more of that as project too, because it was just like, because it was women in body, I wanted to know more about, well, what is the knowledge, right? And what is it that's more specific? And that's when I think that's literally some of the projects that we do are in response to colonization because they made women's voices invisible, right? And then as soon as we make them visible, we say, oh, this is not feminism. It's like, wait, it was this beforehand, right? So that's a disruption because if we keep naming it as feminism, we're reifying a Western system in terms of what's happening here. And then literally doing harm to these traditions, for sure. So, and again, that's where I use this book in terms of Kucha Baldwin and very specific quotes in terms of when it becomes a decolonial practice, because it's in a response to how my body has been defined, right? But then even in that, the ceremony is the rewriting. So then we actually show that it's going back to these traditional ways. And that's what I think, ironically, people will talk about English and how it's like this, deficit, but you can do really amazing things just by putting stuff RE in parentheses. I think it's really powerful, in terms of what it says about our processes. Yeah. Thanks for the question.
I also have a question for Dr. Martinez. You were saying in the beginning that the conversation around Indigenous gender needs to be seen within ecologies and genealogies, sort of disrupt the simplification. And I'm curious about the ways that the complexities of Indigenous gender can also help disrupt the simplification of ecologies, like the way Indigenous ecology, this conversation around Indigenous ecologies, thinking maybe specifically like traditional ecological knowledge or those kinds of conversations, and if you could expand on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it actually ties even to the last presentation too, in terms of like, how do we even understand nature? So even initially, right, the human nature binary, that's part of the binary, which is the colonization project, right? Which has created all kinds of problems, which is why we need conservation, right? In new ways. But yeah, going back to, more traditional epistemologies, cosmologies, you want to have that separation. And that's also where I start with, rivers being gendered, because even the idea of anthropomorphism, like we've moved to understanding that these aren't just human behaviors, they're behaviors, right? And their characteristics. I think that shapes our relationships and our understanding of nature. So it's not just me having a personal relationship to this, which is what often happens. It's just that personal relations. But like even with the women in the fisheries, what's the science? I can guarantee you there's science that's going on there. We don't tend to talk about it that way because the value in Indigenous places is relationality. So that's where we heard about the intergenerational. But I want to be able to then help people understand the knowledge that's there. And the knowledge is more than me just like talking about how to cook, right? And some of those other things, because they're reading the tides, I can guarantee you, right? right? So like, how are you actually, so that's what some of these projects is the disruption piece. Because we need to disrupt even how we think this is even methodologically like sound, or are we kind of continuing to almost just exotify like Indigenous women and Indigenous voices, right? It's like, oh, we made them all invisible, now they're visible, but is that, are we giving the depth to it? And that's where I want to go, because I think there's a lot more depth that's going on, yeah.
I think that's really wonderful. And I think on that point, it's like a super important comment on decolonization and how people talk about it in a lot of academic circles, especially folks that are interested in learning how to like incorporate that into their methodologies. So I'd be curious to like hear anybody, you and Jen, anybody else, Juliana, like, you might want to like reflect a little bit on that, you know, because it's
Sure.
become like, not only is it like politically important and like necessary, but also like can be fall into the trap of what you just said. Like, is it actually doing that? And it's under that valence or that name, but it's not really like achieving that end. So just be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
I mean, one is that we've gone to qualitative research in a lot of these spaces. So I would encourage people to read my article on storytelling, because there's so much more ethics and responsibility to that. And I really worry that we've oversimplified that. It's that just have people do stories and now we're good, you know? But particularly because that's also an Indigenous tradition, right? And then you call it that and think everything is that, right? So there's particular protocol, there's particular expectations. So I think methodologically, we need to be better at that. I think it's more than just letting everybody participate in terms of reviewing interviews and so forth. You know, like in a classic CBPR, which is community-based participatory research, I find my responsibility heavily on the P side. And I feel like we've even dismissed ourselves as researchers in terms of the participation side, in terms of helping our participants in some ways elevate their knowledge and elevate literally what it means to do these things, right? And we've kind of just given deference over, right? And I think that it's not fair that they would necessarily know what to literally, I actually was telling this story about, I did interviews with a number of Indigenous women. This is like my project that started and was around what medicine is in Indigenous spaces. And I remember very vividly like asking, and it's a much bigger project. And there was all kinds of things that came out of this methodologically. Because a lot of people understand medicine in Indigenous spaces, and it's literally epistemology. That's how I got into it, because it's about how you live your life. But I'm interviewing this woman, and I knew all my participants at least 2 years beforehand. And they're like, well, what do you think it is? And I gave her my answer of what I thought it is. And I'm like, but I can't use it, like, because that's me. And she literally repeated what I said and goes, now you can use it. Which is so much more about this real dynamic process that really what this means. So what are we seeking to find out? Are we just seeking to get visibility of voice? I think we need to be better at what's the voice that we're actually seeking to elevate, to erase that invisibility. It's much more than just presence. It literally, it is knowledge. We can't just say that because people do this is the knowledge part. And that's where I want to go to the science, and I want to say more because there's depth to it. And it doesn't mean that there's a lacking of significance around the relationships, but that can be the exotification. It's like, they're intergenerational.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It gets oversimplified, and that's concerned. I'm a big proponent of mixed methods. Big proponent of it. And I actually would say that I'm also a much more staunch qualitative researcher in terms of how we do that beyond just interviewing people, focus groups, participant observation. You know, there's this other phrase that we do methodologically is observant participant. Because it actually does other things. Like, yeah, there's all kinds of other ways in which you can do qualitative research, but we've gotten to the storytelling one a lot. And honestly, you want to change systems, conservation policy kind of stuff. I talk about it often is that we can raise empathy in storytelling, but empathy doesn't tend to change policies, which is why you need mixed methods, and you need to be able to do some of these other things to prove it and back it up. Use our evidence. Yeah.
Is there any emerging category to refer to what you said instead of feminist, like just not to put everything under the feminist word?
I mean, that's where I would say Indigenous gender traditions. I mean, that's where you'll see more people talk about it as gender. And again, feminism being only used in specific spaces in which it's really doing that decolonial project. Yeah. But again, I was saying with these two books, I mean, there's more and more, which is also, again, it's symbolic of the fact that gender is really significant in Indigenous communities. And I would even say almost in this kind of notion of a kind of two system, I'm not gonna call it binary because it's not the same. You know, ways, because there's expectations of what it serves in balance, what it serves in peace, what it serves in harmony. Those are really important. And again, the colonial projects is what's changed it in terms of that damage. But, you know, stay away from the sexiness of five gender or the the two-spirit thing too, like, oh, Native people, two-spirit, like, that was bastardized too, but yeah.
How that the construction should be done and how it could be addressed when working with multiple dimensions of identities. For instance, when working with Indigenous women, but also Black women, but also like mestizo women, how it should be addressed in that case.
Which part addressed?
Like that part of deconstructing feminism and feminist approaches.
So one of the things that you know, there's another article, it's been a little while ago, what do we call it when the decolonial goes pre-colonial? Like, so that's one of those that I think about. So if I'm working in all those spaces, right? And so one of the things is, what am I trying to research? Am I trying to research how colonial practices have impacted populations? That's a specific question. You know, am I trying to understand people more fully? I want to go to the pre-colonial stuff. You know, I want to go there, right? So, but well, your question at some level is going to dictate that, because they're massive projects. They really are, right? But I think that we need to be careful of what our question is. And if we're asking a question that we think is giving, and this was a book review I was doing yesterday, someone's like, this is about agency. It's like, you know, Native people would never use the language agency. Like, it just wouldn't be there. So what's the question in the language that I use, and what am I trying to uncover? And we may have to think about our own framing around some of these things to get to, are we seeking to understand people as themselves or as product of colonization? And we're definitely products of colonization at times, right? But is that your question? Or are we actually really trying to immerse ourselves in, you know, ways of being, doing those kind of things? Then I think that there are other questions.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure.
Want to be respectful of people's time and
Yeah.
want to say, like, if anybody has a final question, potentially, or comment.
My brain is in turmoil. I'm filling out a lot of questions, but they're not articulate yet.
Well, it's very fast. It's somewhat violent to like run through everything so quickly, you know, but
That was a good thing. But it was really
Super
nice to have
interesting.
you. Yeah, thank you.
very
so very
grateful
much.
for everybody's time and participation and for sharing, and hoping that this is a starting point of a conversation or series of conversations rather than like an endpoint in those. Yeah.
Maybe one last thing is that our department is starting our master's program back up again.
Awesome.
And I will share flyers with folks as I'm teaching our theory class in the fall.
Okay, that's
So
great.
would love you all to be there,
That's fantastic.
which is also different populations, but I will be doing a theory class. So please come.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
great.
in the fall.
That's great to know. Thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you so much. Great, thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Juliana.
It's-
Thanks, everybody in the online world.
Just Google
Bye, everybody.
and my name, and you should get it. Don't even know the title.